Hello and welcome to the Undressing the Spirit podcast, where sex and spirit go hand in hand. Join me, Tamara Powell, on a no-holds-barred adventure into the psyche and beyond every conceivable limit. Welcome to the Undressing the Spirit podcast. I'm your host, Tamara Powell. Today we will be diving into the sweet spot between East and West when it comes to holistic health, and I mean that in every sense of the word. My guest today is Dolph Todd. Dolph is the founder of Yugen Services, where he offers coaching, holistic healing, and education using the 3 principles methodology, among others. Dolph holds a master's in psychology and has extensive experience working as a mental health counselor, specializing in mindfulness, wellness, and recovery. Dolph has received training in Buddhist psychology, Daoist philosophy, and generally spends a good deal of time with his nose in a book. He's currently completing a doctorate in classical Chinese medicine. Dolph describes himself as a passionate seeker of direct experience and a deep lover of eating, enjoying nature, and connecting with others. Welcome, Dolph. I'm so excited that you're here.
Well, thank you very much.
I feel like we should let our listeners know that we actually met way back in grad school. It feels like forever ago now, when we were both finishing our master's in counseling psychology.
To be fair, we actually met at the beginning when we were just starting our master's degree, and we'd all the classmates had introduced themselves except for you and one other person sort of sitting against the wall, and no one knew who you were. And so I went over and started talking with you, and it was a great conversation. You know, we were having all of those, what are your dreams, what are your goals, what are your passions kind of conversations. And I go back to sit down, and everyone starts asking me, who's that girl? You know, who is she? What she want to do? And I'm like, I couldn't remember your name for the life of me. So I just went, oh, that's sex therapist lady.
That works. In my head, Eve's song, Who's That Girl, is playing. Fun timesies. So I adore you to pieces, and I know my listeners are going to too, because your journey is absolutely fascinating. Can you give us a brief overview of what your childhood is like before we get to the good stuff? Because that's the good stuff too. Like, they have to know where this person comes from before they can understand the wonderful anomaly that can change their lives.
All right, so allow me to embellish just a bit. My sister was born in Hawaii, on the island of Kauai, and that's where I was conceived. And apparently I had 2 gay uncles, close family friends, who my mother took a pregnancy test because she wasn't quite sure, and so they took the pregnancy stick and put it in the Buddhist altar that was already built into this shack.
Oh my God, I didn't think I know this story. This is juicy.
Right? So my gay uncles prayed at the Buddhist altar that held the pregnancy stick that confirmed that I was going to come around someday. And
Yes.
so then 9 months later-ish, I was born in Saudi Arabia and lived there until I was about 4. And then we moved to Pensacola, Florida, where I would later get my master's degree. And then we moved to Egypt for 2-3 years. And then we moved to Louisiana, the border between Lafayette and Broussard. And then we moved to Saudi Arabia again. And I was there for about 5 years. And then I did high school in Pennsylvania, college in North Carolina, spent a year in Maryland, Delaware, pretending I was finding myself.
Pretending as in that's what you were telling yourself you were doing, or telling other people?
Mostly I had a sense of what I wanted my life to look like, my work to look like, but there wasn't really an easy-to-access option for it. It wasn't like I saw a job and thought, that is perfect for me. So the best option I had was going into counseling at the time with dreams of a PhD in psychology. And so I took a year off to assess, do I really want to spend all of that time and money and potentially develop an anxiety disorder just to get a degree?
Oh, yes. So when you look back on your childhood, because I mean, holy crap, what a journey, such a world traveler. What effect do you think that had on your worldview, both like psychologically and spiritually? Can you pinpoint any of those?
Yes, I can.
Share with us, please.
Right. So a bit of my background is, my mother is very what, Tamara, you might call Zen, very straightforward, very hit you with a stick. Yes.
Yeah.
Whereas my father has more of a passion, emotion-centered aspect going on, and somehow I ended up in a wonderful blend of the two. So growing up, I was very emotional and also had this very driven intellect, I think. I don't really know. All I know is my own experience, right? So I'm just guessing. But
that's what matters.
When we were living in Egypt, I was about 6 or 7. There was this moment, and I say a moment, it was really a period of maybe 6 months, maybe a little shorter than that, where everything sort of fell apart. The class that I was in went from a very cohesive group to very splintered factions, and I had friends that were Egyptian nationals or Palestinian, Pakistani, and some of them didn't speak English, but we all played soccer together through that unspoken language of childhood, just having fun. And I had American or Canadian or Western friends. But there came a point where I think, as happens to us all, name-calling started happening. We're at that age where we're recognizing that, hey, other people experience the world differently from me, so I could be wrong. And there comes that sense of insecurity. And so I didn't really want to choose between one group of friends or the other. I didn't really want to take sides, and what ended up happening for me, I really perceived that a lot of the Western friends didn't want to play with me because I wasn't as rich as they were, and I wasn't as Christian as they were. And a lot of the Egyptian locals or other kids out there didn't want to play with me because they thought that I was too white and too Christian.
How funny and sad.
So I'm standing with sort of feeling this bridge of being pulled in some directions, and I go to tell my mother about it, who my parents were always working hard to support us. And I'll never forget that day. She was cleaning the oven, and she looked up at me and said, "I don't have time for your shit. Figure it out."
And how old were you? Like 7?
Yeah, about.
Wow. What did that do to your worldview?
So what that did is every option that I had attempted to reach out for to say, help me make sense of this, crumbled. The professors, the teachers weren't really paying attention. My parents were really busy with their own stuff, and this was just one of those time of life experiences I think we all go through. And so I had I'll call it a privilege now, I had the privilege of having to sort through it on my own. And of course I was already heavily introverted as a child, so it worked in my favor. But as I was working through these options, I started off looking at, okay, when kids insult me and it hurts, what are the ones that hurt? And I realized the insults that hurt the most were the ones that I sort of believed about myself, the ones that I took in, I gave life to. Those were the hardest ones to dismiss, the ones that stuck around kind of like a thorn.
Oh my God, pause. I love what you just said, the stories that you gave life to, because now with both of us being counselors, I don't know about your experience, but it seems to me that human suffering often comes from that right there. Like, it's not so much about the experience. Like, I'm an existentialist diehard, right? So you you talk about frickin' Viktor Frankl in the concentration camp, and he still found meaning and purpose out of something that was meant to friggin' destroy everything, both energetically and physically. And I'm trying to picture you as a sweet little munchkin at 7, feeling completely torn between two worlds, so to speak. And that's a story that has always resonated with me, being multiculturally raised myself. I think it's one of the reasons why we're such great friends. But here you are at 7, torn between two worlds, asking for help, and everyone's like, screw it, deal with it on your own. And you, at that young age, in your worldview, was like, oh, okay, here's something that I'm going to have to make sense of. What are the stories I'm telling myself? What are the stories that I'm going to allow other people to have life in?
Yeah. That was a much shorter summary than I was saying.
That's our friendship in a nutshell. You give all the pretty roomy wanderings, and I'm like, yeah, bam, boom goes the dynamite. So, okay, that explains a lot of your worldview. But then, fast forward, you finish your bachelor's in what again?
I got a bachelor's in psychology. Okay,
you did. And then you're pursuing counseling later on after your year of wandering, finding yourself, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And so as a counselor, and you and I sat under the same program, knowing that you were this multiculturally world-traveled individual leaning towards, at this point, Buddhist philosophy, right?
Yeah.
How did that play out in your experience of Western psychology as we were getting trained? Oh, I know.
So the memory that comes up is it was maybe the second class of our first semester, and we had this professor who taught psychopathology.
Which for our listeners is what?
So psychopathology was the class that talked about essentially diagnosis, what happens when things go wrong, and the labels that we give people for it.
Mm-hmm. And every culture has such a different view of this, so this was really important for us as Western practitioners.
Absolutely. And so the professor opened this class talking about how the DSM-5, which is the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual, in its 5th revision, although at the time it was the DSM-4 revised, was created, and all of these labels were created for the sake of clients, for the sake of people. And I took exception to that. That really rubbed me the wrong way because, one, that's not what I had learned in my undergrad, but more importantly, anytime somebody says, I have done this thing for someone else, they're imposing their own beliefs, their own ideas onto somebody else, and that's just wrong.
Interesting. And the DSM was kind of hailed to us as like the holy grail, right? Like this is the psychology Bible. Client walks in, they say, hey doc, here's what I'm struggling with. You flip through the pages and go, this meets the criteria for an adjustment disorder, for example. That must be what you have. And then the reason that's important is because it then informs our treatment plan as counselors. So if you have an adjustment disorder, now we are going to prescribe whatever, cognitive behavioral exercises, breathing exercises, affirmations. And so what you're saying is, contraire, there may not be as much altruism in this. Or maybe they think that there is. However, they can't help but be, subjectively biased.
One of those words that's really come alive recently, privilege. And so that's my experience. It's the privilege of the counselor to say, well, this is what you are. When in reality, if you look at the history of the DSM and diagnosis, it was created by when the field of psychology started. There was no field. When people were first exploring this terrain and deciding, what is this? They needed something to call it. And so amongst themselves and the people that Ray recognized as their own equals, they got together and said, well, I'm noticing this cluster of things, so let's call it this and that. So the primary purpose of the DSM-5 and the labels is actually for coherent communication, similar language.
Which definitely has its place, right? Because if you called me up for a case conference and said, hey, Tams, I think I'm treating an adjustment disorder, I would already have somewhat of an idea of what you might be talking about.
Yes, and that is certainly of grand significance, very important. But for me, what's most important is the human being that's in front of me.
Yes and yes. So here we are sitting in psychopathology, and he says the DSM was meant for us to help treat individuals. And where did it continue to go awry for you?
Well, I ended up getting into an argument with the professor about how its history and development was actually created by professionals for professionals, and that a lot of the popular movements in psychology, the humanistic movement and Frankl and Rogers, actually showed we need this very human-centered core. We need to be present with people, and we need to see the humanity in people, and that without that, therapy suffers, healing suffers.
So I feel like once again, that little 7-year-old munchkin is now sitting in this university classroom and is being asked to bridge the gap between East and West. Like, you either get to choose Western psychology and its paradigms, or you are choosing something else. Is that the way it felt?
Not for me, mostly because I can be an obstinate ass. So, for me...
Do you wonder that that's how people were looking at you, though?
Not particularly.
Okay.
You know, when I feel impassioned, I just go for it, and to hell with it.
And I like that about you.
So for me, the experience was one of, this is a problem in the field. You know, if instructors who are training the new generations are teaching people to draw these lines and these divisions, that's a problem with perception. Right? And so for me, it wasn't about the field of psychology is flawed. For me, it was about the people who represent the field of psychology have flaws, which, congratulations, we're all human. So.
Right. So it's kind of like a check your lens, check your privilege, bro.
Perpetually.
Okay. And so how did you wander into Buddhist psychology? So
very similar to the little me when I was 7, who was much angrier than I think you're giving him credit for, was had all these big questions about authenticity, about I see such a wonderful spark and life in each person I meet. There's a different representation of the divine, so to speak. You know, Rumi says that God broke his mirror into thousands and thousands of pieces, and we're all holding a piece within ourselves, that it's together and our differences that combine to create this symphony of life rather than just monotone droning noise. So
I just
me,
had a sapiosexual orgasm. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
Continue.
So for me, at that young age, I'm looking at these things as far as what is life and what is meaning, and these labels and self-criticism and self-doubt, these things that get in the way, and this suffering, this burden that we all carry. And as I'm looking around to see who else is talking about this, really the most accessible and the first group of literature I found on it was Buddhist. So that's how I fell in love with that literature. I went, oh, they're saying the things that I'm feeling.
Right. What's interesting, though, is that, well, you know, Buddhism has been around, and even in the West, it's been really picking up movement since the 70s, and it's almost become a pop phrase, and there's almost like a hipster movement to it at times. I think in the psychological arena, it's still a newer thought, which is kind of fascinating when you think of that. It's been around for thousands upon thousands of years, but it's that integration, that sweet spot I said at the top of the hour, that is now really picking up movement in my experience. But you didn't just stop at Buddhist psychology. You went further into Daoism, right?
Right. So the first book that I ever picked up that for me was what I would say purely spiritual was the Tao Te Ching. And interestingly enough, that was my gateway book to Buddhism.
Oh, how funny.
So it's come full circle, so to speak.
And so for our listeners who aren't familiar with the, you know, beautiful nuances that are differing in that, can you explain why that would be such an interesting choice?
So the Tao Te Ching is one of the 3 books that are considered the core or the center of Daoist philosophy, and which is separate from Buddhist philosophy. They come from their own cultures and histories, and more information on that is a podcast in and of itself.
Very true. But can you give a brief anthropological worldview with, Buddhism being more culturally this way, while Daoism being more culturally this way, geographically and in their ideology?
Sure. So Buddhism, really starting with, it's attributed to Siddhartha Gautama, who was born in India, and the philosophy there really coming out of a culturally specific time and place. And so Buddhism evolving as a reaction to a lot of the philosophies of the time, which were focused on the spirit is pure and the body is not so pure. So we need to learn how to overcome the body's urges. And so there were a lot of practices such as fasting and these sort of extreme conditions so that we can push through them and connect to the Brahma, the divine, the one that connects us all. And Siddhartha Gautama's view of Buddhism was actually quite medically prescriptive. Suffering exists, it's real, we can all suffer. Suffering arises due to craving or hanging on or getting caught up in things. There's a cure for suffering. Yeah. And the cure for suffering was described as the Eightfold Path. And so here are these 8 interconnected avenues of thought to cultivate and consider to reach nirvana or enlightenment. And so that roughly, vaguely, almost doing
perfect. No, beautiful. Because then fast forward a bunch of years and we've got a bunch of different paths into Buddhism and to Buddhist psychology, just like we would in Christianity or any other type of spiritual thought. Now, Daoism, briefly, is how different?
Right. So depending on who you want to get in an argument with.
I like it.
Daoism has very shamanistic roots, and as a philosophy, it was pretty broad, and so it didn't really develop as this unique school where there was a particular head. It more so developed as, hey, there's this collection of philosophies that seem pretty similar, so we're going to build a fence around it and call it Daoism. And so Daoism really culturally stood out as it was evolving in time as compared to Confucianism. And so Confucianism is all about social propriety and social ritual, how we interact with each other as human beings socially. And Daoism was more about being who you are, this innate nature that each of us has, that when we fall too much into social prescription, we end up covering up the majesty or the purity that's within each of us.
Hell yes. Authenticity for everyone. I can see why you'd be drawn to that. So take me back. You're in your master's program in counseling psychology. You've wandered into Buddhism and now Daoism. You graduate and you start working in the field like most people do. What happened to make you think, oh no, not just this, let me actually, you didn't jump ship, but I guess you kind of did for a hot minute. You're now finishing a doctorate in Chinese medicine. Why?
So let me just say, I'm just starting a doctorate in Chinese medicine, so the journey
still counts.
Ahead of me. I had a few experiences in counseling that were so wonderful as far as being present with people who had experienced polysystemic trauma, all traumas in various sectors of their lives, individuals who were just struggling with college to individuals who just wanted to figure out what are emotions. And so there were some really beautiful, transcendent aspects to it for me in the work. And yet, when I looked at the view from within the field, how other professionals were telling me I needed to do my job, there was a lot of hierarchical sentiment being passed along. doctorates are above doctoral interns, and doctoral interns are above licensed master's clinicians, and licensed master's clinicians are above registered interns, and registered interns are above students, and it's a very dictatorial process. But more so than that, time and time again, I would have individuals coming into counseling as a stopgap or almost a last resort. And it becomes this fascinating dichotomy where, from that Western philosophical standpoint, there's that Darkesian split. I think, therefore I am. Soul or essence, which is pure and separate from this very mechanical universe of cause and effect. And so, time and again, I'm seeing this disparity where clients are coming in as they're seeing me as a counselor as a last resort because they've already gone to doctors. They're willing to open up their bodies, give me a pill that will flood my brain with the chemical that I need, or cut me open. They're willing to expose their bodies in the most intimate ways, but they're not willing to expose themselves in the most intimate ways. And it became this really...
Whoa, pause. That was so beautiful. So you're saying that by the time a lot of clients get to us, they have been willing to expose their bodies in an intimate way, but not the rest of their self. I mean, if that's not a prescriptive statement on our culture right now, hot damn. And we wonder why there's so many people running around with avoidant intimacy issues. So What did you do with this realization?
Well, I spoke to fellow professionals, and I really tried to get a sense of the field as it stood now. What is its primary use? And I had a number of doctoral level counselors, psychologists inform me that even though we perform similar duties, we're practicing different professions almost, because I lacked the competencies that they had gone to school for. And while I certainly agree that I am nowhere near their level of training as regards certain areas, I've never been able to let go of that Rogerian core of humanity, that we can learn everything we want to learn in a book, but if all we're doing is cutting and pasting in therapy, we're blaspheming. And so I came to my own truth, which is, as a clinician, I was being asked to be a stopgap, a catch for individuals when the more Western medical doctors had failed. And so people would go see a doctor, they'd get a pill may come with side effects, so they'd go back to the doctor, they'd get a second pill to offset the side effects that gave them more manageable new side effects. Then they'd come see me to help manage the more manageable side effects.
That's quite the process, yes.
It was, right? And I was feeling stuck, very limited in what I could do to help. And I wanted to understand more about essence, more about spirit and soul, more about fundamental experience of being human. And the days of existential psychology seem to have come and gone, at least for the moment. And it's a lot more...
We can have drinks on that at another day, yes.
a lot more behavioral at the moment, which is fine and has been proven effective in many cases, but it's not my passion. And so I looked around for who's talking about soul and body and emotion in a very interconnected, related, matter-of-fact way. And lo and behold, it's this very Daoist philosophy, this very Zen experience, which Zen is actually Buddhism as it filtered east through Daoism and then got to Japan. Present moment, Chinese medicine became the growing passion or interest of mine, as far as you can't talk about soul and body as things that are separate. And that when we're talking about a lot of things that Western medicine is now prescribing, diet and exercise, these things have always been spoken about in Chinese medicine. That what we put in our body affects our spirit. And the way we treat our spirit affects our body, and the way we treat our environment affects, and so on and so forth. So.
And one of my favorites, of course, when we're talking about Daoist medicine and Chinese medicine, has been their view on sex. So I was going to have to hit up that, because you sent me an amazing screenshot of your textbook the other day, and you have got to share with our listeners some of the Daoist philosophies on sex and spirit before I let you go.
All right. So keep in mind, I'm just starting my program, so my knowledge is very limited. Mm. And it's true. Anytime I find anything tantalizing, I have to send it your way. Daoist philosophy and sex. So
not the whole of it, but just some brief snippets of things that are coming out in your lectures and the way that they approach it.
Right. So there's a few schools of thought within Daoism. One school looks at sexual expression as, again, one of those innate aspects of ourselves. And we talk about, in Chinese medicine, Jing, or essence, and that sexual activity impacts our Jing. When we connect with other people in that most intimate way, hopefully, we're relating on a very deep level, and we're dealing with fluids or aspects of the body that relate to Jing or essence, this deep aspect of ourselves. And so, from a certain perspective, not having sex can be harmful. Having too much sex can be harmful.
Yes.
Now, there were also much written about Daoist sexual practices, cultivating sexual activity as a way to achieve enlightenment, and there's all sorts of stories about, like Lu Dongbin, who historically is written about as a bit of a womanizer, who would have sex with women but not ejaculate. He'd reach the edge but not release, and so that would help him not only store up his own Jing, but also receive some Jing from the women he was with, and thereby energy. But it's also fair to say that there's quite a lot of literature written that the more you get caught up in these rituals and these practices, the more you're wasting your own time.
Agreed. You're just following another thing.
Yes. And so, as much as is written about how to go about those sexual practices, there is an equal amount written that worrying about cultivating the spirit through just sex is wasting time. Because we're more than that. We're more than just spirits bumping uglies.
Yes. Now there's a tweetable for you. We are more than just spirit bumping uglies, said Dolph Todd. To me, at the end of the day, it's about authenticity, of course, another existential buzzword. So it's like, as far as how much sex a couple should be having, well, what works for them? How little sex? Again, what works for them? How we're having sex? I just find it fascinating that the Daoists were very sex positive, and I feel like that's something that we miss. I think we're erotic positive here in the United States, but we're not always sex positive. We tend to overly eroticize everything to our detriment. So this podcast has flown by for me. Tell our listeners where they can find you and what you're up to these days, any projects you're working on, and how they can get a session with you, because you're pretty freaking fantastic.
Well, thanks. If anybody has appreciated my wanderings, bless you. I can be reached at my website, which is www.yugen services.com. And there's contact information on there you can reach out to me through. I am a full-time student, and I also work a bit and give talks when I can. So I'm a little busy, but I always make time to pursue my passions.
Which is still very much client-centered work, and I love that about you. And I will have links to that in the show notes for everyone. Dolph, thank you so much for sharing your wanderings today.
Well, you are very welcome, and thank you for keeping me on track. I have a tendency to wander.
I love it. I think we're the perfect yin-yang. So thank you again. And to our listeners, check out the show notes and everything that Dolph's got going on. I absolutely recommend his stuff, both as a client and as a colleague. Thanks for listening to the Undressing the Spirit podcast. I pray you found some inspiration and titillation today. As always, I am forever grateful for 5-star reviews, comments, and subscriptions on iTunes and anywhere else you may be listening to this broadcast. Please note the information provided is not meant to convey professional, psychological, or medical advice. If you could use such services, I highly recommend seeking them out from someone you trust. To get in touch with me personally, please check out ariatherapy.com or talesfromatrapezoid.com. Until next time, everyone.